Welcome, everybody, to Women Plus We've Been Waiting For, conversations we've been having throughout 2021 on what needs to change in philanthropy and impact investing, and even all the way through ESG investing to get to a place where there is more capital going to solutions that are actually moving the needle on the world's most pressing issues. And today we are having our last episode of season 1 with a really special woman, Toni Johnson. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So, Toni, you are the CEO and founder of Mission OutLoud. I came across your work by reading one of your articles, or latest articles in Impact Entrepreneur, and just saw that you have this incredible background across policy, government, philanthropy, and impact investing. And most importantly, you have been really vocal about what needs to change in this industry so that we get to a place where we are having more impact. So I'm really excited that you came to talk to us today.
Thanks for having me.
And so, Toni, we had our first call last week, and I almost wish we had recorded that call because it just felt like we dove in immediately in kind of what is frustrating about this industry. And so I want to go back to where we were last week and really ask you about some important points that you made, starting with you stating that climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's an economic problem. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that and explain what you mean by that statement.
Yeah, I mean, at its simplest, where do these emissions come from? Why are they happening? And the chief driver is economic, right? You have production of factory goods, you have people going to work, you have shipping of goods across the globe. So at every level, and particularly those big source points of emissions, that is all driven by economic output. And if you look at what happened during the financial crisis, is our emissions dropped, particularly in the United States. We just, without doing anything, without any kind of policy shift, our emissions dropped dramatically. Why? Because economic output dropped around the world. Because we were in a severe financial and money crisis. So when we think about climate change as solely an environmental problem, or we talk about it as if environmental was the chief issue, we're actually framing the problem, I think, in a way that allows people to kind of slither out of, being either culprits or, pushing the solutions where the solutions need to be. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to the financial crisis and just drop economic output, but, if you're thinking about, cheap plastic goods being shipped from China to the port of Los Angeles and then shipped around the country where they're in, low-income communities and dollar stores and Walmarts, we should be having a different conversation about what we're outputting and why we're outputting them. And so as I have, I was a longtime environmental reporter and an energy reporter, and thinking about it's what are the inputs and outputs. And we've done a lot of talk about, we know we need to get off fossil fuels, but we don't actually understand. I think a lot of people don't understand how we're using fossil fuels. We know coal is bad. We know we want less, SUVs, but we maybe don't understand that outside of the United States, oil consumption is driven by factories because they're electricity grids and other factors. So diesel fuel is being used to power a lot of factories in India and China and parts of Africa. And so, what our driving point for oil is different from other people's driving points for oil. And when we're having these conversations and we don't know that, we, might have solution sets that look, when we're looking at China and we're talking about what China is doing versus what we're doing, or what Japan is doing, we're not on the same page. And I say that as a polity. I think the policymakers are, I used to write briefs essentially when I was at the Council on Foreign Relations. For policymakers, they were not energy experts, but they were going into these discussions. And so we would write these briefs and backgrounders to help them understand what all of these nuances were very quickly, and they didn't have time for a 500-page report. But for the rest of us, the polity, when we're thinking about policy options, when we're looking at our policymakers going into the foreign policy space, I think we need to be more educated and informed about how all of these processes fit together, so that we can have a better discussion about climate change. And I think that's just, getting stuck in the science of, what is 2 degrees this, and how many, how the weather has changed. Fine, but that actually isn't where the discussions need to happen. We need to have discussions about economic output. We need to have discussions about things like remote work, because people don't need to drive everywhere. We need to have discussions about, changing communities so that there are sidewalks so people can walk to the store. So because we have put this as a environmental problem, we don't see the actual full solution sets that we could be talking about that have knock-on benefits, right? Health, I covered global health, and one of the big things that has changed, pre-COVID, was that infectious diseases were not the drivers of mortality. The top drivers of mortality now across the globe are non-communicable diseases, heart disease, diabetes. And so when you start talking about those interventions, you can't tell people to walk if the air quality is bad. You can't tell people to walk if there's no sidewalks and it's not safe to walk or ride a bicycle. So when we are not taught to be systemic thinkers as a rule, we're taught to silo everything into a little box, and climate change is a systemic problem. It's not just an environmental problem. So that's kind of what I meant.
I love that, Toni. And, there's so much I would love to add to that. I completely agree. I mean, I think this is something that was really frustrating watching the conversations that took place at COP26. One, women with your opinions and very well-informed opinions and very important voice are not represented at the table where the negotiations are happening. The most vulnerable people on the planet who are going to be most impacted by climate change and are the least responsible for creating what we're seeing in the world today are not represented there. And thirdly, nobody's connecting the dots. We're now all focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions as if it's the only indicator that matters in this conversation around climate change. But what are you going to do when communities don't have access to water sources because all the worst water sources are dried up or contaminated due to open defecation? What are you going to do when hospitals don't have what they need to operate or treat patients because of things that are linked to climate change? And so I completely agree. I feel like a big missing point to your point is that we're not connecting these pieces together in a way where we're thinking holistically, and we're having the right people at the table driving those solutions. And I think that's really influenced by another point that you made, which is, this is also tied to the fact that for so long now, money drives everything we do. Instead of us being in this place where we are driving money, right? Like we've just gotten to this societal place where we have to burn ourselves out. We have to, cut corners or do all these things to endlessly be able to make money. And in the case of our economic system, it's short-term financial gains above everything else. Even if there's talks of changing that, it's still the number one driving factor. So you made that point and I found it fascinating. And I want to hear a little bit more for you. Like, what does that mean to you that to say that money is driving us instead of the other way around?
Yeah, so, I am on the finance committee for the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, and we're trying to move the endowment off of Wall Street. And that's led to a lot of interesting conversations because we want to get into much more community driven investments and think about stakeholders who have been traditionally left out of financing Indigenous communities, Black communities in this country. As we're having these conversations, it was really interesting to me because when you use the language of finance, it makes it very hard to get back to the point of doing this. And so you get into, ROIs and, asset classes and all of this language. And I talk a lot about that in these meetings. I was like, well, how do we're going to have a different conversation. Do we need different terminology, different language? Because what happens is that language is very limiting. It's very precise, right? This is all supposed to be math and economics, and it's all about precision, but it leaves people out. And to me, all money is a tool. Money is a tool for people to get to do something, to make something happen. It's a proxy for value. It is not value in of itself, but that's what it's become for a lot of investment practices, for a lot of philanthropies. Even when I was at the Heron Foundation and we were looking at the endowment, and we were looking at it from a place of we're trying to help people in communities help themselves, particularly out of poverty. And so, early on in Heron's inception, those strategies looked a lot like traditional grant making, focused on low income, helping low income people become homeowners, helping them become banked, investing in, communities that were traditionally, disinvested in. And after the financial crisis, and we'll just keep bringing it up because it was the first transformational moment really for the globe in the 21st century. And there was this realization that poverty in the United States is not a marginal problem, it's a systemic problem. And one of the big barriers is job quality. How much are we paying our workers? Do they have benefits? Do they have a path to growth? I mean, we saw that this week with this awful, instance in Kentucky with the candle factory workers and, not being able to leave, and, all of these conversations with the Kellogg striking workers about mandatory overtime and what's a fair wage and what's a fair employment practices. So as we were going through the endowment, we were really asking ourselves, where is our money positioned? What is our money invested in? And what do we think that money is doing in our communities? And so, one of the biggest employers in the endowment was the prison industry. And so we had a conversation and we were like, well, do we think this is even a good business model? Are they good jobs? They're actually, prison jobs are not very good jobs. They're low paying, high stress, highly toxic. And then the whole business model of the prison industry is highly extractive to poor communities on a number of levels. And so we just disinvested. That was just one step. We had conversations about Apple, which is, whether we wanted to be invested in Apple and how do we feel about their employment practices? How do we feel about their environmental record? And so when you do that, when money stops being the driver and you drive with your values, the money still went somewhere. We still had investments, we still made money, we still, did better than 5%. But the way in which that money was operating in the community was very different. And I will just tell this final story about Heron in particular, because it's one that it makes me happy and makes me sad. So right before the financial crisis, which we know is a housing crisis, and Heron had a lot of position in housing. And so on the grant making side, we had technical partners who were, helping would-be homeowners get ready to take a loan. And about late 2006, early 2007, these partners came back and said, something's weird's going on. we're telling these folks to do things, and then they come back the next day with a loan when they weren't ready. So we went to our bond manager and said, we don't want to be holding any positions where the mortgage holders couldn't afford the mortgage at issuance. So when the financial and we know that bonds, that's where they put all of the bad, these bad iffy mortgages in these bonds. And so we weren't holding any bad paper when the financial crisis happened. And so I tell this story because for me, it's a good example of how it looks when you do the due diligence from a place of values for your stakeholders, not just values for your bank account. And it did mean something to the bank account too, right? But for the stakeholders writ large, it was a real setback to the 20 years that Heron had spent in these communities trying to help homeowners, help people become homeowners and start to build wealth. And so, we can't take a pat on the back for it because we still lost, our investment in those communities that was a social impact investment. We lost big time, but from a money standpoint, we didn't lose any money. So this is that terrible place about what's driving what. And I think in particular, when we're talking about philanthropy and impact investing, we have to be sharper about how this all works together. And when we're banking, value, that it doesn't have to show up in our bank accounts. It doesn't always have to show up in our bank accounts. And I think that's what I mean about whether we're driving the money or the money is driving us.
I love that, Toni. And I feel like what I'm also hearing from you is we can't expect philanthropy, impact investing, even ESG investing, right? All these different financial tools that are out there to try to steer capital in ways that will address the big issues of our time without asking the hard questions, right? Because so many of these financial tools, whether we like it or not, are part of a global business, financial, and I'll say even wealth system that is not optimal. It's not normal that there's this level of concentration of wealth in the world. It's not normal that, there's $1 trillion worth of capital locked up in endowments, and we're still adopting a foundation model where only 5% of a foundation's resources is really going to impact driven work. And some members of our audience will understand that technicality between the foundation, endowment, and what we mean by 5% being paid out. Some may not. And so I just wanted to highlight, building on what you're saying, that the big message here is that there is so much capital that has been earmarked for charity, whether it's locked up in foundations or in donor advised funds or in other mechanisms, none of which are wrong. There's no right or wrong answers, but it's how we use them that is the big important piece. And secondly, it's asking the hard questions in terms of what is the overall financing doing outside of charity. If we're investing in fossil fuels in prisons that are exploiting poor communities or reinforcing inequality, but then spending 5% to give money to build a school in Kenya, that's not going to save, that's not going to change the bigger picture, and it's definitely not systemic change. And so I just found it so refreshing to talk to you, Toni, because I think that in our philanthropic and impact investing, community, we do want to focus on the solutions and okay, so how do we do it better? But it's really hard to get there if we don't unpack what is not working and that we don't have a candid opinion on these big things. And so that's what really stood out for me in your piece in Impact Entrepreneur, which I'm just going to say again, I loved. It was probably one of the best philanthropy articles I read this year, where you made an important point. You said the most forward-thinking philanthropies and philanthropists are either spending down their assets because the idea of perpetuity is a luxury we cannot afford, or trying to democratize funding, decision making, and cede power and privilege back to communities, right? They're trying to move money out of Wall Street and in ways that are really trickling into our communities and setting those communities up for success in the long term. So, how do we get more philanthropists to take on this approach, Toni? And if I could be perfectly frank, like, how do we get philanthropy to do better?
This is an easy and a hard question at the same time. So the first thing I'll say, because it's been on my mind, I recently read Philanthropy for the Rest of Us by Lucy Bernholtz. It came out this past fall, and it's really about middle-class philanthropy. And philanthropy, I believe, is basically defined as love of humanity. So the idea that philanthropy has to be something that only super wealthy people get to do, I think is the first narrative that we need to kind of attack and embrace, right? Like, we are all in our own ways. And I, encourage people to read the book because it's really interesting, because it really helped me kind of start to talk about what democratization looks like. So, and so on that point, I also worked at the Stone Center for Socioeconomic Inequality, which is a bunch of economists who research inequality issues. And the big area of focus right now is wealth concentration, because inequality research used to be primarily focused on the middle to the lower income brackets. But, realizations, particularly since Thomas Piketty's book, that high concentrations of wealth actually has a potentially deleterious impact on societies, particularly democracies, and what should we do about it? So, the easiest thing is taxes, right? Because taxes allows us as a polity to engage on how the money is spent. So that's the easy, hard part. But on the bigger issue, I think we have this narrative, and I always say I'd rather just everybody pay their taxes, and the idea that somehow if taxes were higher for wealthy people, they would give less. This has been just like the jobs piece, just not true. It's not true. It's not like when taxes in the United States was like marginally 70%, there weren't Rockefellers and Fords, creating foundations and building hospitals and whatever. They were still doing it. They were still giving money. And that's something else that we should be really clear about too, is a lot of the money in big philanthropy, wealthy donors give to institutions they're adjacent to, their colleges, the colleges where their kids go, the big, libraries and, sanctuaries and things that make them feel good, but aren't necessarily what we all need. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that that's not going to improve the school systems or build roads. We need a tax base, and we shouldn't allow philanthropy to, starve the government so that they can come in and, be a savior, but they're an inadequate savior because, as my mentor Clara Miller says, it's like if you added up all the philanthropy, if you added up all the big institutions, it's like 0.1% of the US budget. It's nothing. It's a drop in the budget. It's not enough money. So so when I think about this idea of what is philanthropy, I first want to be more inclusive and say, we can all be philanthropists. And if we can all be philanthropists, we should not have to feel that we need to lionize, a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg just because they have more assets. Part of the reason they have more assets is because they're paying less taxes, right? And they're not just paying less taxes, they're paying less wages. They're not actually investing in the communities in ways that that's what we talked about at Heron, where we were trying to push companies and employers to invest more in their workers. We had, before COVID, there was all this talk of there weren't enough trained workers, but companies in the 50s and 60s used to train workers themselves. So if the schools don't have money to do it, and you're not going to do it, then of course there are not going to be any trained workers, right? So when we think about what democratization of the money looks like and how we're thinking about it, again, it has to be systemic. It's not just about philanthropy, it's about how we think about all the money all the time. It's not where it sits. Philanthropy is a tool, government spending is a tool, corporate spending, investment are tools, but all of that is supposed to be in service of people and planet, right? But
Exactly.
instead, it's in service of the bottom line. And good luck if you get something.
Exactly. And that's why we're in the mess that we're in right now. And so, Toni, I wish we had more time to chat. We're up for time, but it's so valuable to hear your insights on this. We are definitely going to do another interview in season 2. I just really, really appreciate your time, again, your voice, and the chance to learn from you. So thank you for coming, and stay tuned. We're going to see you again on season 2.
Thank you so much for having me, and you have a great rest of the year.